Sunday Gospel lectionary reading this week is from John chapter 2, verses 13 to 22, and it's John's account of the so-called cleansing of the temple by Jesus. It's actually really interesting moving from having been immersed in the early chapters of Mark's Gospel for the last few weeks and then turning back to John, because we can see the difference in emphasis and difference in style of the way that John writes and therefore the way that we read it. We realise that in Mark's Gospel, Mark does his theological work, as it were, through the driving narrative. And this happened, and this happened, and Jesus said this, and so on. So Mark does his work by putting things one next to the other. John is very different. Instead of putting things next to each other, John does his work by putting things above one another, by having double meaning. This particular bit of narrative is really carefully crafted and shaped, and we need to pay attention to the shape of the different events in a way that we don't quite in Mark's Gospel. And John's use of the Old Testament is very different, whereas in Mark we found a density of allusions. We have in John here a kind of window into one particular Old Testament text. Of course, this account also raises some intriguing questions about how do we relate it to the Synoptic Gospels. Each of the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, have an account of Jesus cleansing the temple right at the end of his ministry as the climax and the moment, the thing that finally triggers the opponents of Jesus and lead to his crucifixion in his final Passion Week. But here we have John giving an account with some quite important differences, I think. And of course, the main difference is that this is positioned right at the beginning of Jesus's ministry. So let's have a look in detail and see what we can see. Our passage begins with, "It was the Passover of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." And we notice some important connections and some important changes from what's just gone before. Chapters 1 into chapter 2 had time markers, but they were relative time markers. So Jesus meets the first disciples, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, various things happen. And then after 3 days, we see the wedding at Cana in Galilee. And it seems as though John is using these relative time markers in order to create a sense of perhaps a first week of a new creation, or perhaps a new sense of Sabbath when Jesus turns the water into wine. But here we have a change from relative time markers to an absolute time marker. It was a Passover of the Jews, so that only happens at a certain time of year, March or April, in the spring. And it's curious that he says it was a Passover of the Jews. I mean, after all, who else would be holding a Passover? It's a Jewish festival. And we already begin to see some of the ambiguities in John's Gospel. In the fourth Gospel, we actually find the language of the Jews used in 4 different ways. First of all, there's a kind of a neutral, ethnic or cultural or religious reference. So the Jews are the people who hold the Passover festival. Just as we heard earlier in the narrative about the wedding at Cana, it's the Jews who have purification rites, and therefore there are 6 stone jars there at the occasion. The second way that this gospel uses the language of Jews is to refer to the Judeans, and I think this is what happens later on in this passage when people question Jesus and he responds to them. Because the word he uses, Judai, it can mean Jews or it can mean those living in Judea, the southerners as distinct from the northern pilgrims who come to Jerusalem from Galilee. And then again, another use is where Jesus comes into conflict with the leaders of the Jews. And it's clear that when John talks about hoi Judaio, the Judeans, the Jews, he clearly is meaning the leaders. Now, there's a last intriguing use in chapter 8, verse 31, when Jesus is getting into a dispute. John talks about the Jews who had believed in Jesus, who seem to be particularly antagonistic in their opposition now to his ministry and his teaching. And when we're reading this, we have to be very careful about how we interpret the Jews, because some of the language which appears to be what we might call anti-Semitic or give rise to anti-Semitic views is actually talking about an inner Jewish conflict between Jesus as a Jew and the leaders of the Jews. After all, this gospel is very clear that Jesus is Jewish, that his followers are Jewish, that the writer of the gospel himself is Jewish. I think Richard Borkham is right. This is a Jerusalem-based disciple. And so it's very difficult to say that this gospel is anti-Semitic in any ordinary sense of the word. But given the Jewishness of this gospel, it's curious that he introduces this festival as the Passover of the Jews. What's going on there? Well, we read in chapter 4 when Jesus has the encounter with the woman at the well in Samaria in John 4:22. Jesus says, without any compromise, salvation is from the Jews. But it seems as though here John is actually writing to explain what's happening to those who are outside. It's as if he's saying, by using this language of the Passover of the Jews, he's telling us that salvation is from the Jews, but salvation isn't just for the Jews. There are going to be other people as well who are going to discover who Jesus is for themselves. And this gospel is written for them as much as it is for the insiders. So Jesus goes up to Jerusalem, which is itself an interesting description. What does he mean by that? Well, when we talk about going up somewhere, I think we probably mean two different things. One is that this place is of particular importance. There's a tradition which says that if you go to Oxford or Cambridge, you go up to university. Historically, the train lines running in and out of London were up to London, that was the up line, and then down away from London, signifying its importance. I guess we also tend nowadays to look at maps, so we're sort of looking from the air, from above, and we're looking north-south. I live in Nottingham, and I think I probably usually say I'm going down to London if I go on a trip. Well, I used to do that, and maybe one day I will again too. But here I think the reference is much more physical, because in the previous few verses, John has said that Jesus went down from Cana to Capernaum. And here he's talking about the physical shape of the land. This gospel is very interested in topography and geography. It's interested in where places are and how they relate to one another. And you would always go up to Jerusalem from Capernaum, from Jericho, because you're having to climb up the hills into the hills of Judea and Samaria. There's a sense in which John's view of events is at ground level, and he's very conscious of the fact that there is a significant climb involved in getting up to Jerusalem. And this early focus on the Jerusalem feast, on Jesus' presence in Jerusalem and in the temple, gives this gospel a distinctive orientation. Whereas the Synoptic Gospels focus on Jesus' Galilee ministry and then have him go on a journey, in Luke's gospel, a long journey. The middle part of his gospel is all about Jesus' journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And then the climax happens in the last week of his life, in the city and around the temple. Here, John has a very different focus. Jesus as an Orthodox, as a practicing Torah-observant Jew, he goes down to Jerusalem several times for the festivals. And of course, John actually mentions 5 festivals altogether, and 3 times he records Jesus as doing something at the time of the Passover. And it's that gives us an idea that Jesus' ministry lasted for 3 years, for 3 successive Passovers from John's gospel. It's often been said that John organizes his gospel for theological effect. But actually, I think that it's the Synoptic Gospels which do this. It cannot be the case that Jesus only went to Jerusalem at the end of his life. He must have been there several times before. But the Synoptics make sure that Jerusalem becomes the focus and the climax. Whereas for John's gospel, we see Jerusalem as featuring all the way through. Jesus is active in ministry right from the very beginning of the narrative. And so Jesus goes into the temple area. And we just need to be a little bit alert, because actually within the narrative, there are 2 different words that John uses to refer to the temple. The first one here is the word hieron, and that would normally designate the main temple building for a pagan temple. But here, for the Jerusalem temple, there are 2 distinct parts. There's the outer temple courts with the colonnades around them, the stoa, and then there's the temple building itself. And here, this word hieron actually signifies the temple precincts. And in fact, some English versions translate that, said he went into the temple precinct. So what does he find? Well, he finds people selling cattle, sheep and doves, and others sitting at the table changing money. And there are some very good reasons for all this activity. The people are concerned about fulfilling the regulations of the law, but their situation has changed. So if you look at the Old Testament, you look at Exodus 12, verse 5, then in order to Passover, for example, to offer a lamb, you have to take the best lamb from your flock, an unblemished lamb, and you have to take it down to the temple and to offer it. But carrying a lamb all the way down, if you live in the north of the country, transporting it all the way down to the temple is hard work. It's inconvenient. It's not straightforward. And of course, that text kind of assumes that people are all looking after their own small herds of animals. And with the changes, socioeconomic changes, with the rise of artisan craftsmanship, with the advent of day laborers, then it means that people will not all be doing that. So in order to actually fulfill the letter of this law, then something has to change. So there was a roaring trade in selling these animals for sacrifice and for offering, or animals of different kinds. And in fact, this is one point where John's account is quite distinctive. He's the only one who mentions the cattle and the sheep in the temple precincts. The synoptic gospel accounts don't mention those at all. The second thing that has to happen is you have to change money. The regulation in Exodus 30, verse 11, says that each adult male has to offer half a shekel. And with the advent of Roman occupation, then the currency, the normal day-to-day currency, has changed. And so if you are going to fulfill the letter of the law, then you have to find someone who will sell you a shekel. And there's a real irony in this as well. And that is that the shekels that were used were a kind of currency called a Tyrian shekel, minted in Tyre. Now, Tyre was a city which historically had been the enemy of Israel and one of its oppressors. If you look at Ezekiel chapter 27, you'll see a diatribe against Tyre and how God will judge Tyre and bring it to destruction. And in fact, that language in Ezekiel 27 forms the basis in the book of Revelation for the judgment against the great city Babylon as the enemy and oppressor of God's people. And the reason why the Tyrian shekel was used was because it was a much higher percentage of silver than other currency that was available. But actually, the Tyrian shekel had on it had the image of a person's head, and it had an inscription praising the wonders of the city. So all sorts of compromises were going on in order to fulfill the letter of the law, which is, not least, you might say, a little bit ironic. So how does Jesus respond? Well, dramatically, and with courage and conviction and passion. He forms a whip out of some rope cords, which of course would have been there, because if you got to tie up your animals, then there'd have been rope lying around, and he drives them out. And in fact, this account in John's narrative is so vivid and so detailed. He makes his whip, he drives out the cattle, he drives out the people, he scatters the coins of the money changers, he tips the jars over, and he overturns their tables. John is very vivid and very detailed about the actions of Jesus. And that's why whenever you see artwork or whenever people think about the action that Jesus takes, they actually look to John's account rather than the synoptic accounts at the ends of each of their Gospels. In fact, in Luke's account, the description of what Jesus does occupies only a single sentence, whereas here in John, it's detailed and it's vivid. Again, just maybe slightly challenging or overturning our expectations that John is the spiritual and the symbolic gospel. But in fact, what we find here is more detail than we find in the others. What is the reason for Jesus' anger, for his direct action? By the way, if you ever ask the question, what would Jesus do? It does seem as though making a whip, driving people out, and overturning their tables in a rage is one possible answer. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus' objection is that this was supposed to be a house of prayer for all the nations. It seems as though Jesus' problem there is that the outer courts, which were supposed to be places for the Gentiles to have access to come as close as they could to the temple precincts, are now being blocked up. They're being obscured so that people can't actually get to, as it were, close to the presence of God. Perhaps there is a question of injustice. Jesus wasn't alone in objecting to the trade that was going on here. Because of the demand for animals, because of the demand of money changing, it meant that the temple treasury became an enormous storehouse of wealth. And inevitably, people who couldn't afford the sacrifices ended up having to owe money to the temple. In fact, when it came a few years later to the first Jewish war from 66 to 70 AD, one of the first things that the rebels did was that they burnt all the records of the debts that were owed to the temple treasury. They were angry that those who ran the temple were in collusion with the Roman authorities and that this trade contributed to the oppression of the people. So there may be something to do with economic justice. But actually, as we read on in the fourth Gospel's account, Jesus says this, "Get out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a house of a market. The word he uses there is emporium, which we get through Latin, our word emporium, meaning a market. In fact, many translations just say, you've turned my Father's house into a market. But Jesus is a bit more specific than that. The language of my Father's house is language that he uses later on when he talks about there being many rooms in my Father's house. It's language that Luke has recorded in chapter 2, Jesus using when he was 12 years old, and he stays in the temple after his family have left, after going down to Jerusalem to celebrate one of the pilgrim festivals. And he says to his parents, didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? But instead of this house being a place for God and for the worship of God, it's become a house of activity. It's become a house of a market. It seems to me as though Jesus is saying, look, the business of God has actually taken the place of God himself. It's all too easy, isn't it, for the things of God, our busyness, our practical concerns, and their practical concerns here were necessary, but the practical concerns seem to have taken center stage rather than this temple being focused on the presence of God. And then John includes a fascinating narrative comment. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. Now, several things are really fascinating about that little comment. The first is that John is already looking ahead to the disciples' post-resurrection reflection. The disciples remembered. There's an interesting little hint there. The word for remember is quite close to the word for imitation. And there's a sense in which when we remember things, we actually go back in our mind's eye and we rehearse, we imitate what happened. But I think there's another little clue in our English word, remember, because it can have a sense of remembering, putting things back together. It's often when we reflect on things in the past, we remember them, we put them back together again. That's when they make sense. And here we have the disciples, after Jesus' death and resurrection, after the end of the narrative, actually looking back and putting it all together again. It's only after Jesus' resurrection that all these individual events actually make sense. I think that's a bit of a helpful reminder to us when we're reading the gospel narratives. Sometimes our tendency is to say, oh, we're reading it as if it's kind of a press description, an eyewitness account, just simply saying what happened without reflecting on it, as if it was a transcript of a film. In fact, these accounts are all reflections on the events, and they incorporate that reflection. We're reading an interpreted account of what Jesus did. So it's not just the events of Jesus' life, but it's their significance as understood by Jesus' disciples that we're reading. The things have been put together in the light of the later events of Jesus' life and ministry. But then they remember the scriptures, and the scriptures also help them to understand and make sense of Jesus' life and ministry and what he did and who he was. And they remember a verse from Psalm 69. It's an extraordinary psalm. You might want to just pause and go and read it. It's a psalm of lament of someone who is facing death. And they're facing death because of being persecuted by their enemies without cause. And they look to God for vindication. And they appeal to God on the basis of their focus has been on a passion, a zeal for God's house. And the disciples remember that zeal for your house will consume me. And in a sense, the first meaning of that is just Jesus' passion, Jesus' concern that we see in his dramatic action. But of course, as with everything in this gospel, it has a double meaning. It has a second meaning. Jesus has a whip in the temple, and maybe it's a reminder pointing forwards to the fact that Jesus himself will be whipped. He'll be scourged in this area. Passion for God will indeed consume Jesus, and it's what will lead to his death. Then we have the central exchange in this passage, and we can see that it's central because at the beginning of the passage we have a mention of the feast in Jerusalem. At the end of this passage, in the following verses, there's a mention of the feast in Jerusalem. So there you have a kind of bookending at the beginning and end of the narrative. Within that, you have action by Jesus. And then inside that, you have two mentions of the disciples remembering. And that brings us to this few verses here at the center of the debate, the center of the narrative. is not actually a question about the cleansing of the temple. It's a question about who Jesus is, what authority he has, and what his real identity is. Now, it's interesting here we get a reference to the Jews. Here, this surely must be those who are in Jerusalem, the Judeans, rather than the Jews in general. And they ask him in very Johannine terms, what sign will you give? You might remember that in John's Gospel, John doesn't talk about miracles, he talks about signs. And Jesus' response, again, has a double meaning. And there are 7, it's believed, signs recorded in John's Gospel. And the question is whether Jesus' death and resurrection might be the 8th sign, which those 7 signs are pointing towards. And so Jesus says, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. Lots of double meaning there. First of all, you do raise a building. Well, you do raise a building if you're a powerful, influential person, you've got lots of money. But the language is also used of Jesus being raised. God raised Jesus from death. So there we have a double meaning. Then, of course, we come to the central double meaning in this passage. Jesus says, destroy this temple. And of course, he's not referring to the building, but he's referring to himself. And this is part of a developing theology for John. We've already heard it introduced in the prologue in chapter 1, verse 14, where the word became fleshed and tabernacled amongst us. In the desert, in the Exodus wanderings, God's presence was in the tabernacle, in the tent in the desert. Now, God's presence is made real by the tabernacle of Jesus amongst his people. The temple in Jerusalem was the sign of God's presence, his Shekinah glory in the Holy of Holies. And now Jesus is claiming that God's holy presence is found in the temple of Jesus' own body. This idea is picked up in other New Testament writings as well. In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul talks about each of us, our bodies, being a temple of the Holy Spirit. Because the Spirit has been poured out on us because of Jesus' death and resurrection, we too become dwelling places for God. And in 1 Peter 2, Peter talks about us being built into a spiritual house, again using this language of the Father's house, with Jesus as the chief cornerstone, each of us being a living stone built into a dwelling place for God's presence. John, as narrator, once again gives us an explanatory comment. The temple that he talked about wasn't the building, but it was his own body. But it's really interesting that in Mark's Gospel and in Matthew, in the account of Jesus' trial, 2 people accuse him of saying he would destroy the temple and raise it again in 3 days. Really interesting little historical cross-reference between John and between Matthew and Mark, because, of course, neither of them have mentioned this claim in their description of Jesus' cleansing of the temple. And it's done in such a way which suggests that this was something that had been said some time ago. So perhaps that helps us to begin to think about the relationship between John's account and that of the Synoptic Gospels. Once more, John comments that the disciples, after his resurrection, the disciples remembered, they recalled what he said, and they believed. Life must be lived forwards, but it can often only be understood backwards by recollection, by looking back. And that's certainly the case for the disciples and for John's narrative here. It all makes sense once you know where it's going to end and you look back from there in order to make sense of each part of the narrative. But within there's an intriguing little mention. Part of the objection of the Jews whom Jesus is discussing things with, they say, this temple, well, in most translations, they say this temple, and here, as Jesus has done, they're not using the word hieron, meaning the temple precincts. They're using the word naos, meaning the central temple building, the sanctuary with the Holy of Holies in it. This temple, most translations say, has taken 46 years to build. Actually, the grammar there is a little bit awkward, and it might be better to read it saying this was built 46 years ago. And in fact, that was the case. The temple complex was initiated by Herod the Great. Herod wasn't actually a pure Jew, but he wanted to be king of the Jews. And he wanted the Jews to have status within the Roman Empire. And so he embarked on these extraordinary, ambitious building projects. The Jerusalem temple was the most striking of it, but he had a number of other building projects in the country. across the country, north and south. And Herod the Great's dates for reigning are, we understand, most people believe, were 36 BC to 4 BC. That's certainly according to Josephus. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that Herod began to build the temple, the Naos, the central part of it, in the 18th year of his reign, and that it took 18 months to complete. Now, if we, as the Americans say, do the math, we take the 18 years, we take the year and a half, and then we add 46 to it. And that takes us to the year, well, either 29 AD or 30 AD. And I think the most reliable estimates suggest that Jesus died in April 33. Now, what I've been intrigued about is I haven't found any commentators who can explain why John has included this detail of history, this detail of chronology in his account. The number 46 doesn't appear to have any symbolic meanings at all. There's a number of numbers in John's Gospel where he just seems to state them and there's no symbolic significance. They just are there because they're actual chronology. It's their actual dates, their actual times, their actual spans of years. Why does he include this number 46? Well, people take two main views about the relationship between this account on the one hand and the synoptic account on the other. Some people who want to, perhaps for good reasons, preserve the integrity of the different gospel accounts would argue that there are two different events, and that the differences we see in John's account, the fact that Jesus made a whip, which isn't mentioned elsewhere, the fact that he drives out the sheep and oxen, which isn't mentioned elsewhere, the fact that he offers a different explanation for why he's doing it, different from the synoptics, and the fact that he has this debate with the Jews. All of these signal something different, and so some would say, well, this is a different event and that the cleansing of the temple happened twice. Others are a bit more skeptical. They simply say that's unlikely, and that instead there's a single event, and John has tweaked it. He's given it a different account with a different focus, and he's put it in a different part of his narrative for a particular theological purpose. In fact, one writer, Alistair Roberts, gives an intriguing account of how it functions here. He says that there's a sense in which that John's narrative gives us a symbolic tour around the temple. So we have the mention of the tabernacle in chapter 1. Here we have the temple, the sanctuary itself mentioned. Then there's, in chapter 4 and 5, there's mention of water, which suggests the lava, the great bowl in front of the temple for cleansing. Then there's the mention of the Hanukkah lights in front of the temple, and so on. So John is kind of giving us a symbolic tour of the temple area as he goes through his narrative. And that's the reason that he moves this event from the end of the story, whether it is in the synoptics, to the beginning. I'm not convinced. I think the symbolism is very often there, but I don't think the narrative reads in a way where there's a sort of systematic symbolic tour of the temple. I don't think the elements are quite in the right order. And besides which, John's narrative isn't nearly so tightly bound around those symbolic elements as we might think. So here's a possible suggestion. There were indeed two different events. Jesus cleansed the temple, as it were, twice. I think it's perfectly possible. It's not historically unlikely. It would have been very difficult then to, if he'd done this once and people had him sort of down as a troublemaker to prevent him coming in, it wasn't as if they had sort of photo fit pictures or posters they could put up anywhere. They couldn't stop Jesus coming into the temple area a second time. And besides, there's a considerable interval of time of at least 2 years between the two different events. I just wonder whether John hasn't mentioned this 46 years in order to indicate that this is not happening at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. This is in chronological time at some distance from the event which he knows we've read about in the Synoptic Gospels. There are all sorts of indicators that John writes his Gospel for people who've already read one of the others, in particular who read Mark's Gospel. So he doesn't need to tell you about the event in the last week of Jesus' life. In fact, maybe this event, which he does include, reminds us that Jesus' death and resurrection are the inevitable ends of this story. I think Alistair Roberts is right on one point, and that is that bringing this incident, recording this incident at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, cast the shadow of his crucifixion from the very beginning. Destroy this temple, language used at his trial by his accusers, starts at the very beginning. The cross is in view from the start. And again, this is a way in which John's gospel is quite different from Mark's gospel. We've already seen that Mark's gospel begins with dynamic and action and success, and straightway Jesus does this, straightway Jesus does that. The demons obey him. His teaching startles all the people. They're all amazed and astonished in all sorts of different ways. There is hint of conflict, but at the beginning of Mark's gospel, the first part of Mark's gospel, is really all about the dynamism and the power and the popularity of Jesus' ministry. And that's why in Mark's gospel, when we get to chapter 8, where Peter recognizes, you are the Christ. And then Jesus starts to say, the Son of Man must be handed over and will be killed, and on the third day raised. It is presented as an absolute shock. Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. But for John, the crucifixion actually looms large right from the very beginning. From the very beginning, we recognize that Jesus is the temple presence of God. We recognize that this will provoke opposition and resentment, and it will lead to his crucifixion. Jesus is consumed with a zeal for God's house, with a passion that people should meet him. And in fact, his passion will lead to him being consumed. And yet, on the third day, God will raise him up. Well, says John, we don't need to long for buildings. At the time he was writing, the temple itself was destroyed. And he's saying to his readers, you don't need to long for the temple to be restored. In fact, you don't need any building in order to meet God in his presence, because in Jesus, we have the temple presence of God, the holy presence of God, to which we can come close.